Thank you, Talia. And we are so extremely lucky today to have with us, probably on 3 different time zones, some of the New York Times finest reporters on China and all issues Chinese. This is a freedom of press conference, and all 3 have been covering China for years. 2 of them, Aiymi and Chris Bakley, have been expelled or have their visas not extended in China in the last year or so, in a crackdown that still to some extent continues against the presence of foreign media. And we are probably seeing now the lowest numbers of foreign journalists in China in recent decades. All 3 aggressively report about developments in China from their respective locations. They have covered the country before, during and after the pandemic, and they have provided readers across the globe with unique insights on a superpower rising. Vivian Wong is a China correspondent, writes primarily about Hong Kong and their relationship with the Beijing government. Chris Bakley is the chief China correspondent for the New York Times, been covering China for much more than 20 years now, one of the most knowledgeable journalists about the country, covers Chinese politics and social and environmental issues. Chris, you had actually a list of stories about Xinjiang region in China. Aiymi writes about Taiwan, covers the intersection of culture, politics, and society in China. And I should say that the Times maintains bureaus in Beijing and in Shanghai, and says that it is hopeful that the Chinese government will allow all reporters to return. And we say that, of course, too. And there are also reporters expelled from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. I want to start off with a general question and invite you all to sort of barge in, maybe start with you, Aiymi. What did COVID-19 do to China? Did it strengthen xenophobe, authoritarian trends? Did it sort of enhance those? Is it a story of a national victory? Is it a theme of a narrative of the superpower doing what other very strong countries like the US could not do? What's the take home for not only for the party, but even looking from a side? So let's start with you, Aiymi, and then afterwards, Chris and Vivian.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be with you all today. It's a really great question. And I think, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. So it's really a shifting narrative. When we were covering the story, one day in when we had heard about the lockdown in Wuhan, we knew that it was going to be a big story in China. And 3 weeks in the middle of February, it looked like this was going to be, possibly the fall of Xi Jinping. It looked like, the Communist Party was getting a lot of criticism for how it handled the pandemic. It was really bad in Wuhan. It was bad across China, and we hadn't yet, the virus hadn't yet spread to other countries. And then a few months in, it was a vastly different picture. We saw that China actually was able to get the coronavirus under control, whereas all these other countries were totally bungling their response to it. And so I would say, we're a year and about 3 months into this pandemic now. I think, at least from this vantage point, and of course, who's to know what's going to happen in the future, it does look like it's been a victory of sorts, or at least the Communist Party has really been able to kind of, use its success in controlling the virus, and at the same time look at how everyone else has been sort of not been able to control the virus at all, to kind of show its citizens, like, look, our top-down centralized model is better than this, democratic model that you're seeing in the United States that you've worshipped for so long. So I do think that it is a victory of sorts, but who's to know what's going to happen?
Chris?
Yeah, I think Aiymi covers it very well. For those first couple of months in 2020, there was a lot of anger within China, and certainly in Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak, against the government. And clearly that was very uncomfortable for Xi Jinping. It is true that the pandemic is far from over, but I think the Chinese Communist Party has already given its conclusion that its experience of last year vindicates its model of top-down control. And what you see repeated again and again in speeches from Xi Jinping and other leaders is this confidence that China has demonstrated its institutional superiority by overcoming the pandemic so quickly and effectively. Now, of course, we can point to democratic exceptions, countries and parts of the world that have done exceptionally well without the kind of draconian controls that were exercised in China. There's South Korea, New Zealand, Taiwan, and so on. Even so, I think if you look at continental size great powers, the United States, the big countries of Western Europe, Russia, India, the Chinese leadership can make a case to its people now that no other leadership of a large power has done so successfully. So that's a message that has continuing, I do think it does have a lot of pulling power for Chinese people at the moment.
Vivian?
I would definitely echo everything that Amy and Chris said. And I would just add that the speed with which the tide of public opinion in China turned back in favor of the government after the initial public anger was really quite astonishing. So, I think it was March or April of last year, I was working with a colleague on a story about how this seemed to be a moment of awakening for people in China, especially young people who were suddenly taking to social media to express anger and political engagement. And we would reach out to people who had just posted something angry on social media a few weeks ago. And by the time that we spoke to them, they were like, no, I've changed my mind, and by the time that we published the story, I frankly felt it was a little bit outdated. So it was pretty astonishing to see how quickly that happened.
I want to ask you, Chris, about your experiences because they're rather unusual. You traveled to Wuhan right at the beginning of the lockdown. You were there, if I'm not mistaken, on the first day of lockdown. And then while covering from there, you had your visa not extended, so you could not continue on reporting. You could only observe, which is always, a delicate situation for a journalist. Not to say even, you don't know what to do with all this stuff that you're sort of gathering, and you want it out. I would sort of guess you found your ways, but I want to ask you about your experiences there as a journalist, about how open people were with you during this trauma, which at the time we thought this is a singular Chinese and specifically Wuhan trauma.
It's a question that brings back lots of memories and brings back some, memories that show my sort of short-sightedness in the early period of the outbreak. I did go to Wuhan on the morning of January 23, I guess the shutdown was. But I went there with this expectation that the outbreak would last perhaps a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and it would be a serious problem, a crisis for Wuhan, a serious problem for China's leadership. But in the back of my mind then, I'd never imagined that this coronavirus would spread so quickly across the rest of the world. So I went there not complacent, but never imagining that it would grip the entire planet in the way that it had. And to be there in those first few weeks was really, and Amy joined us in Wuhan shortly afterward as well. So she can speak to this as well. I think one of the things that I discovered early on is that people there were going through this extraordinary flux of emotions, and there was a lot of anger. And it was anger, surprisingly enough, I always felt that some of the most angriest comments seemed to come from people who were officials in the Wuhan government. You would go to a clinic or a hospital and be talking to people outside, and the ones who would speak, sometimes off the record, but speak most emotionally about what had gone wrong, would be government officials who had some idea about how government worked and what the missteps were. And that kind of anger was reflected among a lot of people in the city. But even then, in the early days, I always thought that the anger was balanced or accompanied at least by other emotions as well. Like people would often say that, yes, we do want some sort of reckoning with the mistakes that let the virus spread. But for now, during this period of emergency, we also have to work with the government. We have to obey these rules. Now's not the time to, to focus on protests. It's simply to get through this emergency. And at the time, that sounded like people may have been perhaps blunting their message because they were speaking to a foreign reporter. But I do think looking afterward, I think we've seen so many other parts of the world that have gone through this period of crisis, and there's emotions in which you can feel anger at the incompetence of our officials, but also a kind of helplessness or a need to be part of this collective effort to get through a crisis. So looking back, I do think a lot of people were feeling this flux of emotions then. And I think what I and other reporters there, and then Aimee as well, were trying to do is try to fairly reflect what was happening in the city. Both the serious problems with access to medical care, with access to medical equipment, but also the sort of extraordinary mobilization that went on there to lock people in their homes, to lock down communities that, as we've subsequently seen, managed to slow and then stop the spread of the virus more effectively than we've seen in many other parts of the world.
That's a great point, because one of the questions I wanted to ask, actually all three of you, is to what extent this pandemic sort of teach China, or maybe enhance the argument that now we have learned all that we can learn from the West, that we have achieved what we can do, and now we don't need, I remember reading a Chinese Communist Party official talking about that correspondence that the Chinese emperor had at the time, a famous story all three of you know, in which he says, we don't need your shipments of goods. We don't need anything from the West. Yeah, and he's writing, that Chinese political, Communist Party official, he's writing what a mistake it was. So it was very much something that lived within the Communist Party. To what extent, maybe because the Trump administration poisoned the conversation with incitement, with racial slurs like Kung Flu and others, to what extent that this story means that China is saying, no, we're grown-ups right now. We don't need to learn from the West. We can actually do it much, much more better. Can we start with you, Aimee, and then Vivian?
That's a good question. I would say that there's definitely a sense of looking inward, and that there was a sort of for a long time, this, as you said, this sort of line that the Chinese government took, that, we are growing, we're in this development stage, we still have a lot to learn from other places. Democracy, China's just not ready for it, but it was always sort of held out as a possible something to, work towards in the future. And I do think that now you see a sort of changing in the sort of feeling of how the Chinese government feels about its place in the world right now. And it's not really this, as you mentioned, part of it is, it's not all on China's being done at its own volition. Like, I think that part of it is just a reaction to how other countries are treating China right now. And there is this almost sense of girding itself for possibly being kind of cut off in the future. And you see that when they're talking about, food supplies and, being able to create its own semiconductor chips. And I think that part of that is, as you said, sort of driven about this kind of confidence in themselves, but also it's sort of kind of taking a temperature of the global environment right now, and knowing that in the future, this kind of, very kind of interconnected, globalized world in which they've been able to thrive so far might not stay the same.
Vivian, I want to ask you this, and specifically when I read your stories about Hong Kong, and about the way, maybe I'm asking, I don't know, that the Chinese government is using the fact that we're all very focused on the pandemic in the last year or so to do stuff that in other periods of time would be seen, as breaking all the rules, internally and otherwise. And we'll talk maybe as we go along about Xinjiang and other elements.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's not settled. I think Chris and I have discussed recently as well the question of what you see the Chinese government doing to Hong Kong, whether it's a reflection of, a distracted global environment, China's success coming out of the pandemic, or whether this is something that would have happened sort of regardless of the context of the coronavirus pandemic. So I think it's difficult to say in that sense, but in general, we can definitely see that the Chinese government is feeling very confident. It, specifically in the context of Hong Kong, is explicitly attacking this idea of Hong Kong's British and Western identity and background, and saying that that's something that we need to teach Hong Kong to discard, or at least stop clinging to so much, and really start recognizing the rise of China and how much we as a country, China, have to offer to Hong Kong for its future development. Maybe
because Hong Kong is seen as a possible model of a Chinese democracy, thus attacking the foundational kind of argument of the party that this is the only way to go, right? Their way.
I think they definitely see Hong Kong as a potential sort of launching pad, I guess, for Western governments and other governments to attack the Chinese model. And so any sort of undermining that they can do of the idea that Hong Kong's Western roots have made it stronger are certainly something that the Chinese government would want to emphasize.
Chris and Amy, I want to ask you about the experience of being journalist in China, which is not a democracy, so it's challenging anyway, and then having to leave China. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a crackdown that began over a year ago and is to an extent continuing. And Chris, you lived in China many years. I think it would be fair to say the majority of the last 25 years. And could you tell me, first of all, about how it came about? Do you think that the Chinese are using Western media as signals, or is it about reporting, or is it both?
So just to be a little clearer, you mean is the expulsion or forced departure of journalists a signal to the rest of the world, or? Is
it a way, we know that it came sort of as a response for the Trump administration doing all kinds of stuff, or this is how the Chinese sort of presented it? And what I'm asking is this something that is being used as a coin by the Chinese government, hurting Western media? Or is it because the stuff you are uncovering, I'm looking at your recent stories about Xinjiang, is so hurtful to the government that they need to expel you guys? They don't want good journalists in the country to begin with.
Yes, I do think, as you were saying, the mass expulsion of American journalists was, at least outwardly, prompted by the visa restrictions the Trump administration imposed on Chinese state-run news outlets. So there was a bit of a tit for tat going there. And Amy, I'm afraid to say, was part of that. I officially was not, in that I'm an Australian national, and so I wasn't caught in that particular net. Nonetheless, I did have to leave China last year after leaving Wuhan and doing quarantine for 3 weeks in Beijing. And I think you're probably right in sort of moving toward the explanation that part of what we've seen here is not simply the Chinese government responding simply to the Trump administration's restrictions on Chinese journalists, but also using this as an opportunity to signal its unhappiness with the direction of coverage of China and its belief that China is being unfairly represented in news reports. And, I think part of the background here is that, I was in China for a good 20 years or more. Aimee has spent a long time there as well. I know that Vivian is very committed to spending a long time there as well. You develop a relationship with the place, with friendships there. You develop a commitment to the story. You develop a love of many aspects of China as well. And, so I never stayed in China for that long out of pure unhappiness with being there. It was a great privilege to be a journalist there, I've always thought. But nonetheless, especially in the past few years, being a journalist has almost inevitably involved coming more directly up against these contentious changes that have been happening in China, particularly over the past decade, as the Chinese government has become more centralizing, in many ways much more controlling, and as we've seen in Xinjiang region, much more draconian in how it treats parts of the Chinese population. Our job as journalists has been to report on that, and I hope fairly and objectively and impartially, but that was the job. So almost inevitably, I felt it was making reporting in China more contentious. It was making our relationships with the Chinese government and officials more difficult as well. In the end, though, our job was to report the story. And I do think that, after a lot of contentious reporting on Xinjiang and Hong Kong throughout 2018 and 2019, I do think if people look back and looked at our coverage of Wuhan and the coronavirus as well, I think they would see that we were all very committed to reporting all aspects of what was happening in China. And we weren't simply there to report the stories that, the Chinese government might regard as negative or prejudiced, but also to report, the immense sacrifices and suffering that people in Wuhan and China went through during those first months of the COVID outbreak, and to report fairly on every aspect of the government's subsequent success in overcoming the pandemic as well. So, I can understand where the Chinese government is coming from when it makes those criticisms. These are contentious issues, but I never saw my job as simply reporting on one side of what was happening in China.
Aimee, could you maybe elaborate also about maintaining sources within China whilst you're not there? I guess most of the people seeing this, most of the journalists seeing this, have never covered a country that is not a democracy, at least not a formal democracy. So it's hard anyway when you're there. Maybe even harder when you're there rather than when you are out. I don't know. I'm asking just about your thoughts about these days.
There are definitely challenges to being on the ground in China, but I would say that by far being there outweighs not being there. I mean, we all have the privilege, as we've been talking about journalism and what sort of motivated them to expel Western journalists. I can't help but think about a subject that Vivian has covered a lot in the last year, which is how they've treated their citizen journalists, the Chinese local journalists, and also the sort of choking of local Chinese media as well. We saw several citizen journalists who were covering Wuhan from up close get jailed and even, prison sentences. So I think it's very clear that they do not want this sort of critical media, anything that might be critical of them, whether it's from a Western journalist or from a internal, Chinese journalist. I think that maintaining, and sort of to that end, the Chinese government has done a very great job of sort of instilling this kind of wariness or distrust among society, especially of Western foreign journalists, to the point where, it is very difficult, I think, to talk to people on the record. People who used to talk, maybe on background will only talk off the record, and people who used to talk off the record to you don't pick up your calls now at all. And on top of that, of course, there is, something that a lot of people have written about, which is the kind of tech surveillance aspect of it. China, of course, has the Great Firewall. We've all heard of that, but the chat messaging app that most people use in China, WeChat, is heavily, heavily monitored, which makes it almost impossible to have any kind of remotely sensitive conversation on that, which as a result now, you know, for Chris and I being outside of China, it's something that you have to weigh a lot. You know, how can I reach a source securely? How can I talk to them? What can I talk to them about? If on WeChat, you know, I think I tried to post some dog photos on WeChat the other day and they got blocked automatically. So, you know, everything now is just sort of, there is a kind of chill. And I think as a result, looking kind of from the outside and kind of peering over the wall, I think it's just much more difficult. I think it definitely changes the kind of stories that we're writing. We'll probably see more stories on propaganda and the kind of things that we see more rather than stories that we kind of hear on the ground. And, you know, those kind of conversations that you just have with people as you're interacting with them every day. And also a lot of kind of off the record conversations that you're having with people. I think those went a long way towards helping us understand what was happening on the ground. And I definitely think, you know, having not been in China now for almost exactly a year, I can feel that unfortunately every day we are sort of losing touch with what's happening on the ground. And I think that's quite unfortunate.
I want to ask you, Vivian, exactly about these things on the ground, because when we look at the story of this year or so, it's of course the pandemic, and the source is of course in China, in Wuhan. And I want to ask you, will we ever know the extent of exactly how it happened? We've been hearing, we had the WHO report, we've been hearing sort of a trend of reporting saying maybe it was a lab leak. And of course, even the numbers of the people who died, will we ever know? Or did the party become so sophisticated that there's absolutely no chance? We'll toil for that. You guys will toil for that, but we won't get there.
You know, I would definitely be hesitant to say, yes, we'll know one day, or no, we'll never know one day. I feel like it's kind of an impossible question. But, you know, of course, that is a question that we discussed a lot. We discussed with our editors a lot, especially sort of, you know, around mid last year as Wuhan started to open back up, was the question of, is it possible to measure what exactly happened here and the toll of what happened in Wuhan? And, you know, and Chinese media and Western media alike have tried so many ways to try to figure this out, right? Caixin did a piece about how there were just lines of people at one particular funeral home trying to collect urns and collect ashes after the lockdown was lifted a little bit. And they were trying to do the calculations of, okay, if you have this many people at one funeral home, you know, what does it mean for the entire death toll? And I think the short answer is it's really the death toll. It's going to be really, really hard, certainly for us as Western media, to get an accurate count. And, you know, that's even setting aside the question of the origins of the virus itself, which of course, you know, the entire scientific community is debating. So I don't feel especially qualified to weigh in on that. But I guess the short answer to your question is I have no idea.
Okay, so I'm going to push a bit with that, Amy. You know, we don't know what we don't know, but in the end, this goes into really when you report on authoritarian governments and you give an impression of knowledge or of a picture, while sometimes the most important things you have no idea about. So it's only what you've been seen, or I don't want to say allowed to see, because I'm talking with people from the New York Times, and you've been covering and saying things in recent months that are definitely not something that the Chinese government would want us to see. But to what extent do we actually know stuff about China that we can say with certainty about this pandemic? For instance, that it succeeded. So sometimes I need to tell my viewers or my readers, look, even if they are hiding, you know, 10 times the number of deaths, 100 times the number of deaths, 1,000 times the number of deaths, it's still a huge success if you're measuring it, you know, vis-a-vis the United States, for instance. So I'd like to hear your thoughts as someone who's been in the ground in Wuhan about that.
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's no question that there is a lot that we don't know. And we know that just because when Chris was talking about his experience having gone into Wuhan early on, I was there, I think, also in the first or second week of the lockdown. And it was an incredible time to report because normally on a lot of these trips, you have a lot of government minders following you around. But in this case, I think because they were in a little bit of disarray because of what was happening, it was free. And also, I mean, as far as I know, it was free. And also, when we were talking to people were so angry that they were very willing to talk in a way that a few weeks later, they all kind of clammed up. We have heard of, we know of Chinese journalists who did a lot of incredible reporting. Some of that came out, but I think most of it, I think one editor at a prominent Chinese magazine said they were only able to publish something like 30% of what they reported because what they reported was so sensitive. So there's no question that some stuff will come out later. Whether or not, what we're saying is completely, these conclusions that we're coming to based on the kind of what we know is just the tip of the iceberg. I don't know if it's completely wrong. And I think that, we are pretty upfront about what we don't know. Though I don't think that it'll come out later. I don't know. I have no idea what will happen, in the future. And if maybe, they'll come out with some report that said like an alien started the virus and, that'll just completely upend everything. Of course, we don't know what we don't know, but I think we know a lot about the Chinese Communist Party. It's been around for more than 100 years or so. 100 years this year. We know that it has a tendency to hide, even if the story might be beneficial for them, if they sort of were more kind of open and told us, kind of explain their whole point of view on things, maybe that, we can understand where they're coming from. That would probably be in their favor, but their instinct is just to cover up and to hide. And I think that is something that, beyond just the pandemic, like we know the sort of how the kind of government bureaucracy works and how it sort of evolved over time. And we can bring that sort of analysis to a situation like this to come away with some tentative, maybe not completely, firm conclusions.
Yeah, Chris, I think it's a relevant question for you specifically because you published lately a story that rarely comes out of China, of documents talking about the internment camps in Xinjiang, and they showed, how secrecy and how spying measures are being used, and they also risen the questions about the numbers of people that are being kept in those camps. So that's an example of a story that usually doesn't come out of China.
Yeah, I don't particularly want to dwell on that particular story. It's just too sensitive in many respects to talk about that. I did want to say something in general, just building on what Amy and Vivian said, though, that relates to that story, which is that the Chinese government now is extremely powerful, in many ways very effective, but it's not omnipotent and it's not always absolutely effective in realizing and achieving its intentions, including when it comes to censorship. So, partly reflected that's in that story, certainly reflected in a lot of the reporting that the New York Times and other news outlets have done on Xinjiang region and what's happening there. Now, a lot of that reporting has relied in large part on this patient, meticulous process of going through Chinese government documents and announcements, going through tender documents, going through company records, going through local government websites that inadvertently reveal useful information, and out of that building a picture, an understanding of what is happening and what in many ways the Chinese government doesn't want the world to understand. So, just back to that, what I just mentioned at the beginning, the Chinese government can be extremely powerful and very effective at suppressing information, but it's not omnipotent. And with any number of stories we're working on now, it's a process of patiently working through what we can find out and building up an understanding from that. And given that we can't be on the ground now, that takes more time, and there's certainly more limits to what we can understand. But now our job as journalists has never been to say we give up and throw up our hands. It's always to try to find another way into a story. And if another way doesn't work, then you find another way into it. And I think that process is, that practice is becoming more important, certainly to us journalists working on China from outside China, but even for the journalists who remain on the ground there, it seems to be becoming more and more important.
Vivian, I want to ask you about the sense of the ordinary, if there is an ordinary Chinese citizen. Does he feel, does he have a specific sentiment towards the country sort of being closing or shutting down to an extent to the West? Does he even sense that? Is it something that only we in the West sense, and he does not? Is it something that lives, within middle classes in Beijing or in Shanghai, or is it something that is completely right now on the outskirts of conversation? It doesn't really, it doesn't matter right now, and something that Western media deals with, but for mostly even middle class Chinese would not.
I think when it comes to the question of, has China learned all it can learn and needs to learn from the West? Should China be more proud of and excited about turning inward? Generally speaking, I don't think it's something that's necessarily confined to elites or confined to, China's megacities. We've done a lot of reporting as a paper, and media in general has done a lot of reporting about sort of how nationalistic this generation of younger Chinese citizens is compared to previous generations. And I think that's true. I think there's so much pride in how far China has come in the previous few decades and in recent years in how it's handled the pandemic, as we've discussed today. And also, whether it's entirely organic or whether some of it is encouraged, of course, by the censorship and by the propaganda, you do see a lot of sort of homegrown sentiment that is turning against the West and very much towards China. So, in recent weeks, there had been a lot of public anger towards brands that had said that they were going to stop using Xinjiang cotton, like Nike, like Adidas. And while some of that was set off by, Communist Party propaganda outlets on social media, our colleagues have reported on how a lot of it did seem to be organic after that point. And so it's sort of hard to disentangle, of course, in China, the roots of public opinion, as it is really in any country. But I think it is fair to say that this is something that people, again, the average Chinese person, although that of course doesn't exist, I think it's something that they are aware of and are thinking about and potentially could be excited about.
I want to ask you, Chris, about the most important person in this story, which is President Xi, who is President Xi. To what extent what we are seeing is the party creating Xi, or Xi recreating the party, recreating those ideas? We know that how the Chinese Communist Party moved away from personality cults after Mao, and it was very worried about being too focused on one person. And now after the pandemic, it seems like he has qualified himself to an extent. Would that be a fair judgment? Is he recreating the party, or he is what the party wanted? Sometimes I hear from Chinese friends, you got it all wrong in the West. You present it as though Xi is, changing the party. No. Xi is the plan of the party. So where are you on that?
I'm going to be a coward and say I fall between the two answers. And let me explain why. This question about, this chicken and egg question about whether Xi Jinping is shaping history or whether he is a puppet of or product of broader historical forces is one that historians are going to be debating 100 years from now. What I would say is that I do tend to think that it's probably a combination of those two factors, that the broader changes happening in China and the broader problems accumulating in China before Xi Jinping came to power created an opening, a shape for a particular type of leader, and he has in many ways fit that shape. But at the same time, the kinds of changes, the intensity of changes, the intensity of ideological and political change that he's brought in, I think has also gone beyond what people would have expected if this was simply a process of a leader coming into power and filling a particular chair that had already been designated. I do remember, back when Xi Jinping came to power in November 2012, when he was appointed Communist Party General Secretary, I went to a meeting in Beijing. I think it was the day after the announcement. This meeting of retired officials and academics and journalists, generally politically liberal leaning, but not all of them, talking about the prospects for China under a new leadership. And I would say in that room at the time, there was a general feeling that Xi Jinping was going to be a more centralizing leader, a leader who felt he had to deal with the accumulating problems in China, particularly corruption and government mismanagement and dysfunction, but not a leader necessarily who was going to be of a strong ideological cast. And I think that was there were a lot of Westerners and certainly Americans who had that view as well. And it's a view that many Chinese people, certainly people in Beijing, shared as well. So it wasn't completely a figment of the Western imagination, those expectations for Xi. But I think what we've seen then is a leader who feels that he has to reinstill in China Communist Party values or traditionalist values that seem to be falling out of favor in the previous decades. And he's a leader who's acted on that imperative with extraordinary resolve and intensity. And that's why I think in part we've seen these extraordinary changes in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and also in mainland China itself. Now, where that comes from, how much of it is due to the individual, how much of it is due to larger political forces, I think in each case you can begin to disentangle a different balance between the two. But I do think it's generally true, once Xi Jinping was installed in power, once he achieved this domination of the Chinese political elite, a lot of what we are seeing now does ultimately reflect his particular imperatives, his particular vision of where China should be headed. That may be a vision that many members of the Chinese political elite and many members of the Chinese public at large ultimately share, but it's not as if they're the ones who get to decide on it in the end. I think perhaps much more so than even, say, 5 or 8 years ago, the Chinese decision-making now is much more centralized around a particular leader, of course, Xi Jinping. And so, again, just to arrive at an answer to your question, I think you can see that the particular circumstances allowed Xi Jinping to seize, to seize the particular opportunities of the moment that were there in 2012. But the way he's used them, I think, has been particularly distinct and very bound up with who he is as an individual leader.
I want to follow up on this with you. I have a friend from China, and one day I told him something like, he's the strongest leader that China had. I use the term strongest since Mao. And he said, oh, no, he's much stronger than Mao. And I said, why? And he said, because Mao didn't know what everybody was thinking all the time. And I want to ask you about surveillance and about the way that surveillance, because this is a global question. What we're seeing in China now is going to be really important for the world. We have never seen a society in such a heavy surveillance, social crediting. This is not something that we've seen in history. Do you think that this changes the nature of politics, even politics in an authoritarian regime, even the Chinese conversation, the traditional Chinese conversation? Is this something that we can start seeing, oh, this leads to that within society, stuff that we have never seen before, even when, during the Cultural Revolution, not necessarily more violent, not more aggressive, but just different?
That's a very big and very important question. I'll try a very brief partial answer, but Vivian and Amy have done a lot more work on these questions of surveillance and censorship than I have certainly lately. So I'll just keep it to a few brief remarks. I do think certainly not merely technological surveillance as such, but also people's assumption that it's happening all the time. And even when Chinese technology may not have reached the point where it is all pervasive and so perfect that it can follow every conversation or every message or every discussion within a home, I think there is a sense now that people feel that it might be able to, and that any comments that they make, certainly outside the family, could get them into more trouble than before. Now, that doesn't mean, at least from my memories of Beijing before I had to leave, that you still don't have very candid and critical conversations in Beijing or other parts of China. You know, one of the reasons why we all miss China, being in China so much, is that even now, even under this kind of surveillance that you're talking about, you still can have those very candid and heartfelt conversations with people who are not necessarily going to be entirely critical of the government, but are going to give their, their sincere view of where things stand and where things should be going. So yeah, I do think it is changing the equation of power in important ways, as you suggest. Ultimately, the Chinese government, like any government, cannot survive enduringly simply on surveillance and intimidation alone, though. So when there are these social issues that come up in China about equality, about equity, about rights, even now, even under Xi Jinping's power, at its very zenith in many ways, there are still people who will speak out. And I think Amy and Vivian could probably speak to that more.
Vivian?
I mean, I think what I would be most qualified to speak on would be what I've been seeing here in Hong Kong over the past few months. And, what Chris mentioned about self-censorship and maybe even overestimating the abilities of the surveillance apparatus have become really apparent here in recent months. Of course, with the national security law that was imposed last June, it's very vague, it's very sweeping. So there is potential for it to authorize all kinds of surveillance, all kinds of indictments of people for offenses that we may not even know are offenses. But I think there is also an awareness, a sort of, sheepish or reluctant awareness among a lot of Hong Kongers that the self-censorship that they are imposing upon themselves does go beyond what might necessarily be required by the law. And, you see people making their own risk judgments, their own risk calculuses every day about what they're willing to say to me, about what they're willing to say to each other. And everybody arrives at a different conclusion, of course. But, I've had people say things to me that I think could potentially be quite risky for them, and they're happy for that to be on the record, and that surprises me. And then I've had people who say things that to me seem quite safe, and really non-political, and they're not willing to have anything attached to their name with that. And so I think that people are self-censoring for sure, and they are aware of doing that. But, at this point, the security law has been in place for I can't do the math, but, a little less than a year, not a very long time. And so I think they're still trying to figure out the red lines. And I've heard people who have had experience both here in Hong Kong and in the mainland say that they actually think that the self-censorship climate is much worse here than in the mainland right now in some ways, because people in the mainland have at least learned to live under that paradigm, whereas here in Hong Kong, it's so new and jarring for many people.
Amy?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, in China, we do see that people have been living under some form of surveillance. Of course, it's intensifying now for a long time. And we constantly see this sort of cat and mouse game of people trying to kind of outsmart the censors, which is really just a testament to how clever most
Maybe I should explain to people who are not familiar, Amy, how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance,
Okay.
on WeChat, if you have a conversation with a friend and you mention a word which is not one of the words that you can use, okay, or it's on a blacklist, the word will disappear, the message will disappear. It's not necessary that someone will knock on your door or give you a phone call or anything like that. It will just disappear. And it's simply not there. If you use the Chinese Google, so to speak, to search for certain expressions, they won't be there. So this is a kind of one thing that will happen. And another thing would be that if they'll see you know, you doing that again and again and again, you might get some sort of a warning shot saying, sort of relax with that. And it can come to you from all kinds of places. These are the reports that I'm reading and the stories that I've been hearing from people living in China. I'm just saying this for our viewers because not everybody is as knowledgeable as you three about China. Please continue.
Right, and the censorship apparatus has gotten very nuanced in ways. You know, I was just talking about posting my dog photos. I used to be able to post them if I turned them upside down or maybe put a squiggle through them, but now you're getting those as well. So
why is
at the same time,
by the way? Why is that?
Well, in that case, it was because a caption mentioned Taiwan. So because I'm in Taiwan. So, but, you know, for different sorts of, it's just, you know, it's become much more sophisticated in how it can read text, and even if it's in a PDF or a photo, how it can read text, even if it's turned upside down. But I also have to say that, you know, a lot of people have heard about China's censorship and surveillance before. Some of it is probably more the stuff of sci-fi novels than actual reality. For example, the social credit system, I think a lot has been made about that, but I don't think it's sort of borne out on the ground in that way. But yeah, generally, you know, what sort of led to this discussion is you originally brought up this question of, you know, does this make Xi a stronger leader than Mao? I think it's a really interesting, fun intellectual exercise. Of course, it depends on how you define strength and whatnot. But, you know, I don't think Mao also had to deal with the internet and, you know, social media. It's difficult to imagine, you know, on the night that Dr. Li Wenliang, the whistleblower that everyone has heard about in Wuhan, the night that he died, there was such an outpouring of anger against the government that night. It's difficult to imagine that happening in the time of Mao. So, you know, also there's the question of, you know, surveillance. You know, one aspect of it is self-censorship, which I think is very real and intensifying in China and in Hong Kong, as Vivian was just saying. But what do you do with that information when you are surveilling? On one hand, it really empowers local officials, local police to sort of go after their own constituents. But does that information necessarily make it up to, you know, Xi Jinping sitting in Zhongnanhai in Beijing? I don't know. I mean, it depends on who sort of he has around him. And I think we can sort of go on forever, as we were talking about earlier, about kind of the black box of Chinese elite politics, but it's not completely clear that, you know, that this surveillance is necessarily kind of coming up to him in this sort of democratic way where he's able to kind of cast this like eye of Mordor, you know, view around China and know exactly what's going on at any minute.
I want to follow up with you, Amy, because you're in Taiwan, and we've seen, you know, regional tensions rising, and we're also seeing the US becoming, and it's actually a continuation of something that Obama said at the time about being the first Pacific president, and it seems that the Biden administration, in that sense, like in many other ways, is sort of continuing this thing, and the invitation of the Chinese prime minister, the Japanese prime minister to the White House. To what extent is the pandemic a watershed moment in the relations between the US specifically, not the West, and learning from the West, but the US specifically and China? And to what extent are we sort of slowly continuing our march into a hypertension in the region between those countries who will not have a Chinese dominance, whether it's Taiwan or Japan or other countries? I'm saying in the region, though it's Asia, it's very far away, but do you think that what we're seeing is an escalation in the process?
I think it's a really interesting time right now because, of course, under the Trump administration and under Xi Jinping over the last few years, we've seen this ratcheting up of tensions between US, China in a way that a lot of people were asking after Biden was elected, whether or not he would try to go back to a sort of more Obama era kind of, you know, peace in a way, sort of with China. And what we've seen so far, we saw, you know, the meeting between Chinese officials and American officials in Anchorage. That was very testy from what we saw. And certainly I think what we're seeing now is kind of all sides trying to kind of puff up their chests and make their positions known. You know, in China's case, especially on the Taiwan issue, it's always been, you know, one of the first things that they sort of make their diplomatic partners acknowledge that there is this one China policy and their stance on Taiwan. And for the US as well, you know, Taiwan is front of mind too, in addition to many other issues. And so we've seen that the Biden administration has kind of continued more of the sort of more confrontational stance towards China, even if it's kind of toned back some of the more inflammatory rhetoric. And whether or not that will lead to a confrontation, I guess, is something that a lot of people are asking right now. You know, just from my seat in Taiwan, I would say that people in Taiwan have been living under this threat of Beijing for 70 years. And so there's not any kind of immediate sort of concern. In fact, there's actually a lot of talk, though, about, you know, about Israel. Actually, a lot of people bring Israel up and kind of wonder, you know, why hasn't Taiwan militarized in the same way, sort of built this kind of sense of immediate threat among its public in the way that you would see in Israel. Of course, the situations are very different. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's a sense that there will be any kind of immediate confrontation, though, of course, we do see generally increase in military activities, which of course always raises the risk of some kind of accident happening, which is oftentimes how these things sort of get set off. But it's something that I think everyone is watching very closely right now.
Okay, so in this regard, Vivian, I want to ask you about the de-dollarization and the story that we might be missing, maybe the biggest story that we're missing right now, the Chinese digital coin, the idea of I don't want to say a crypto coin because it's not exactly crypto technology, right? It's controlled by the government. Is it possible that the Chinese are really heading to de-dollarization? That this is their real aim? That this concept that they need the dollar strong too is sort of something they want to get rid of in a couple of years?
So I have to confess, I know almost nothing about this topic. So if Chris or Amy do, feel free to jump in.
Okay, so Chris, I'm gonna hand it over to you. Would you take it?
I would recuse myself as well.
Okay. So
there's a great deal of excitement about digital currencies in China. Ultimately, they're going to be an accompaniment to the yuan currency. The fact is, across the world, in every currency, electronic transfers are a part of how the economy works. So they're a sort of adjunct to that. Yeah, I think in general, I think what you're working toward is this broader phenomenon that we're seeing, which is the Chinese government promoting this idea, not of decoupling from the world, but of creating more capacity in China so that China is less dependent on the rest of the world, and certainly the United States, for technology, for consumer markets, and for credit. And, you know, that's the trend that comes back to digital currency, but also includes a lot of other changes as well. In particular, we're likely to see a big push on technological innovation, and whether China can succeed in that, whether it can sort of claim a place on the sort of commanding heights of some of these core technologies, such as semiconductors, is really going to be very important in establishing the balance of power in the next decade or two.
So you've been very generous with your time. I'm going to ask you one last question to all three of you. It's going to be kind of a TV journalism question, so forgive me for this. But what's the single most thing, the single thing that people get wrong about China? That people constantly get wrong about China? And Chris, you're going to begin, and then Vivian and Amy, you will have to think about something different.
Okay, you know, as shorthand, when we talk about China, we often talk about China doing this in the world, or China's policy toward the United States, you know, China's intention toward the Western world, or what China thinks. But of course, you know, although that can be a useful journalistic shorthand sometimes, and we're perhaps all guilty of using it at certain points, you know, the fact is that even in China now, even in a highly centralized system such as we see under Xi Jinping, it's a very complicated place in which there are different players, different interests, sometimes rival interests. And, you know, although I think it's generally true that many Chinese people support many policies of the government, it's not true that there's a perfect overlap between public opinion and what Xi Jinping wants and what the Communist Party wants. So I was sort of reminded of that in the discussion that we had just before this about censorship and control and surveillance. And Dr. Li Wenliang, the doctor in Wuhan who tried to warn his colleagues about this virus that he knew was spreading in hospitals then. And, you know, we have to remember that the reason he got into trouble was simply sharing, you know, what should have been information that should have been shared among medical professionals, that there was this novel coronavirus that had been found in lab tests for certain patients, and it could be dangerous. And there were certain resemblances to the SARS coronavirus that spread and caused the China in 2003. Now, the reason why so many Chinese people were angered by, you know, his punishment and then his death is because he was an example to many people of the costs of censorship and excessive control. So even now, you know, we've been talking so much about the power of Xi Jinping, there is a reservoir of sentiment there that says, yes, even if we don't want to follow everything in the West or become a liberal democracy, we do want to speak out sometimes, and we do want to know what's going on. And we do certainly want to know if there's a potentially deadly virus spreading among us. And if the habits of power in China discourage that, then ultimately, you know, the Chinese public is going to speak out against it too.
Amy?
There's so many things I could say, but I think generally that I would just, you know, there's so much talk these days about democracy versus authoritarianism. And I think that binary, while important, sort of shields or kind of covers another aspect that has become very important over the last year, especially during the pandemic, which is the idea of governance. And we always sort of, this is always kind of in the background of our stories and kind of like a write offline. And I'm sure the Chinese government would love for us to write about this more often, which is just that and at the end of the day, conditions and livelihood in China has improved vastly over the last few generations. And we've seen that you know, from one generation to the next, the material kind of lifestyle has improved by a lot. So when people ask, you know, how could one live under that kind of regime? I mean, some people in China ask, like, how could you live in America where there's mass shootings every day? So I think, you know, at the same time in China, you know, there are trade-offs that people make. And I think that they understand that there are sorts of, you know, drawbacks to their government. They're not blind to it, but that in some cases they don't have a choice. And in many cases, you know, their lot is oftentimes better than the lot that their parents were. And whether that's that's going to stay the same is, I think, a big challenge for the Chinese Communist Party. And we're already seeing economic slowdown and whatnot. But I do think that that's important context for people who are outside of China to keep in mind.
Vivian?
This is a perhaps small semantic thing, but it's something I've actually thought about a fair amount since getting to Hong Kong last year. So I'm still relatively new to reporting on this part of the world, but I've just constantly been reminded of the dangers of imposing a sort of Western and specifically American political vocabulary on ideology here. So, you know, because China is a communist state, a communist government, you will often find people such as activists here in Hong Kong who really oppose the Chinese government, who will describe themselves as fervently right-wing, which has a very different implication in the United States than it might here, because I think a lot of people would not associate people who describe themselves as fervently right-wing with those who would also describe themselves as fervently, say, pro-democracy here in Hong Kong. But it's because of the political spectrum of seeing themselves as just diametrically opposed to the Communist Party, which of course on the ideological spectrum is very far left. So I think just, you know, I've constantly been reminding myself even just the dangers of imposing political vocabulary from, you know, my home country of the United States on whatever the dialogue might be here.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all three of you. It was, I think, tremendous discussion, and we really have been so lucky for you to be so generous with your time. I'll be continuing to read all three of you as I do and follow you on Twitter, as I also do. Aimee Chin, Vivian Wang, Chris Buckley, wherever you are, I'm going to read the stuff that you're writing about China. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.